The Premed Year, session number 345. Hello, and welcome to the Premed Years, where we believe that collaboration, not competition, is key to your success. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Gray, and in this podcast, we share with you stories, encouragement, and information that you need to know to help guide you on your path to becoming a physician. Welcome to the Premed Years. Thank you for taking some time to join me and my guest today. Whether you're at the gym, walking the dog, doing dishes, or on your drive to organic chemistry, thank you again for taking some time. If you haven't yet shared this podcast with a friend, I would love for you to take 1 minute and just post it to your Facebook group, your Instagram page, your school's Premed group, Facebook page, wherever you can share the podcast. I would love for you to share it. This week, we have a great guest, someone who is starting medical school at 44 years of age, someone who dropped out of college his first time through because of other commitments and has now made it back to come and be a physician. Let's go ahead and jump in and say hello to Robert. Robert, welcome to the Premed Years. Thanks for joining me.
Glad to be here. Thank you. It's an honor to be here, Dr. Gray.
When did you first realize you wanted to be a doctor?
That doctor question. I think that's kind of, it's a twofold answer because I first always knew I was going to do something in healthcare ever since I was a little kid because my grandmother actually ran I don't want to call it a boarding home. Basically, it's was what we would probably currently call a skilled nursing facility. Mm-hmm. But I come from very rural Pennsylvania area. And so this was a very, rural type thing. And so I grew up around, elderly people who needed to be cared for. And that was just something all the grandkids did. When we went over to see Graham, we helped out. So I kind of took to that early, out of all the things that you do as a kid, from baling hay to, riding dirt bikes to whatever. I liked helping out the folks. I found that very interesting, and probably as much because, those patients tended to take an interest in me as well. And so they kind of, I don't want to say they were my friends, but it was like having a bunch of grandparents, right? It was like super awesome as a little kid. So I knew I wanted to do something in healthcare. But I've always been the type of person who, I briefly touched on this earlier that, I'm a pragmatist, and this idea of being a doctor always seems so daunting because it's such a long process. And so I wanted to do something in healthcare. I probably never really decided. At one point in time, I decided I wanted to be a doctor in high school. And when I was told by my guidance counselor, so I went to high school in Ohio. And so in the Ohio area, we have a thing called NEO-UCOM, which is Northeastern Ohio University's College of Medicine. It's an accelerated program, 6-year BSMD program. And so that was something I was interested in until my guidance counselor told me, he said, well, you can't play baseball if you're going to do this, right? Because I was the baseball was my thing in high school, and I was going to play at the collegiate level. And she said, well, you can't play baseball and do that. I said, well, why not? And she said, it's not feasible. The workload is too much. And so that was the time I said, well, that's just another reason why, being a PA or something. A PA really was kind of one of the routes I was always interested in. So really, honestly, the deciding I absolutely 100% committed to being a doctor when I was probably right about the time I turned 40. So yeah, that
40. Oh, okay. Get the age out of the way.
Right.
That's All right. 40 years old. Okay. So we did a little 1-2 skip a few in there.
Right.
So you are off to college. Did you play baseball in college?
I ended up actually not playing baseball in college either. So
you could have been a doctor.
I just could have been a doctor. No, I like all well-knowing young men who know everything when they're 18. I got married when I was 18 and found that I had to actually work to support a household. And so by the time I was going to college and working 50, 60, 70 hours a week, baseball kind of got kicked to the back burner. It was the one thing that it didn't offer me any money. I was already on a full ride academic scholarship. So baseball kind of got pushed to the wayside. And
so you went to be a PA then, and now you're going back to get your MD.
Well, no, I never even made it out. So I didn't make it out of the first year of college. I put my first year of college under my belt, and it was just becoming so incredibly difficult to go to school and to, try to, make a living, support a household. And I was working at one of my, I don't know, 2 or 3 jobs at the time. And, like all good people, the recruiter walked in and said, "Hey, why are you killing yourself? What do you really want to do with your life?" And I said, "Well, I want to, I'd like to, be a PA or something, or." And so I got this feel, and actually tried to join the Air Force. So I know you're an Air Force guy. I actually tried to join the Air Force, and they told me that I was medically unfit. So to backtrack, to preface this story, one of the things that really got me interested, back in healthcare was when I was 16, I got hit by a drunk driver and had some pretty serious injuries, and spent at least a full year in outpatient therapy, trying to regain full use of my left hand. And one of the things that had happened was, not to be too technical, but I had an injury to my right hip, and the Air Force deemed that injury ultimately made me unfit for duty. And so I said, well, there goes my big chance, for all this free college, all these things this recruiter told me were so good. That's awful. And it was kind of a double whammy because, I'm 4th generation Army. And so I had always planned on serving, but my dad was enlisted, my grandpa was enlisted, and I said, look, if you're going to go in the Army, wait until you get a degree and become an officer, because the last thing you want to do is go enlisted. Well, it couldn't have been maybe a week after that, or maybe it was a few weeks. Who knows? My memory gets foggy, but the Army recruiter walked in, gives me the same spiel. And I said, "Oh, you can save your breath, buddy.
Been there, done that."
Yeah, been there, done that. The Air Force already said you're no good." And he said, "Well, the Army has way lower standards than the Air Force." And I said, "Oh, well, why not? Why not give it a shot?" So, same thing. Kind of I went through the processing, went up to the MEP station and had my exam, and the Army came back with the same finding. Nope, medically unfit for duty. And I said, well, too bad, so sad. Well, this recruiter, thankfully, or maybe unthankfully, was he was a little more persistent then. He said, I get these waivers overturned all the time. You need to go back and see the doc who did your surgery on your hip, and see if he won't, write you a letter saying that, you're capable. Well, as the fates would have it, the doctor who had done my hip surgery, a couple of years prior, happened to have formerly been the chief of orthopedics of the Navy.
No, nice.
And so he wrote a letter, and if I remember correctly, he was he was a retired flag officer, so he signed it, as a letter. And I was in the Army, we have this thing called DEP, the Delayed Entry Program. And so you go once a month, and they kind of teach you military lingo and try to instill a little bit of military bearing in you before you go. And the first sergeant came in, he said, I just got a call, that your medical waiver is overturned. So they overturned my medical waiver. Apparently that was the only other evidence I presented them. So that doc apparently had enough sway, and so off I was.
Said the right things.
I said the right things,
yeah,
right? So,
very cool. So you joined the Army, and were you able to get into a medical field to scratch that itch for yourself?
Right, absolutely. So I had to fight for this, because when I was at the processing station, I did fairly well in my ASVAB, and so at the time, I don't know if it was just standard or if I got singled out for it. They made me take another test called the DLAB, which is the Defense Language Aptitude Battery, which kind of tests your capability of learning a foreign language. And I did really well on the DLAB too. And so they said, well, look, here's the jobs we're offering you. And they wanted me to be like a trilingual interrogator and stuff. I said, no, I want a medical job. They said, well, you don't want a medical job. This is a way better job. It's a way more marketable skill. And so I said, look, I want a medical job. And at least at the time, the Army used to be the only service where you could actually pick your job, right? You actually knew what you were doing before you went in. And I said, nope, I want to be, I want a medical job. And so I signed up to be a medical laboratory technician and headed off. I did my basic training and then headed off to Fort Sam. And with the Army, with all advanced medical specialties, you have to start out, with your basic combat medic training. Everybody goes through combat medic training because, when conflict breaks out, everybody needs to know how to be a medic because there are way more, there's much higher demand for medics in the field than there are for lab techs or x-ray techs or whatever. And so everybody goes through basic training, basic combat medic training, and then you go on to your advanced individual training. For me, that happened to be the longest IET school that the Army offered. It was 62 weeks of initial entry training at Fort Sam Houston.
Wow.
And it was pretty grueling. At least 2/3 of my class ended up being reclassed, so they failed out of kilo school. At the time, it was 91 kilo. The Army has since changed their classification for medical specialties, but high attrition rate. But one of the reasons I picked this job, going back to the PA route, is that med lab techs in the Army, again, at least at the time, had a really, really high rate of, once you got through your initial commitment, you could direct commission to PA school, right? So you do your 6 years as a lab tech, and then you'd go to OCS, and then the Army would send you through PA school. So again, that was kind of my thing, and it was never that I had this like yearning to be a PA. It just seemed that, like, being a doctor, like going through 4 years of medical school and 4 years of college and umpteen years of residency, just, it seemed so far away, which, is probably the irony of my life, that it took me this long to finally decide, well, I'm just going to go ahead and suck it up and do the whole process now.
Do you think part of it is, you said you grew up in kind of a rural area in Pennsylvania, just not having exposure to physicians to see people doing it and seeing that it's reasonable and people having a life while they're doing it? Right.
I mean, there was one doctor within, I don't know, maybe I would say maybe 50 or 60 miles. And it was a family doc. And particularly what he did seemed not all that interesting to me at the time anyway. And so, just colloquially, again, talking with a guidance counselor and stuff. And I said this, well, what interests you? And I said, well, I grew up, I liked helping my grandma out with the patients. And so that's something that interests me. And, well, you've got good grades, you've got, good ACT score, if you consider medicine. And I'm like, well, yeah, that sounds like fun. And then, when you find out how long that is and you go, well, what else can I do to do that? So I think part of it was maybe just steering from guidance counselors that, they never, the idea of the difference between a physician and a physician's assistant or an advanced nurse practitioner was, none of those things were ever explained to me other than the time frame that it took to complete the schooling. So nobody ever said, well, this is what you'll do different as a physician, or this is what you'll do different as an advanced nurse practitioner. And so, based on limited information, which was the length of training, I thought, well, PA sounds like the best route.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. When did you at some point go, okay, I've had enough of this Army stuff. I want to go to medical school?
And, that's another thing. I never really had enough of the Army stuff. I love the Army. I was, I grew up, like I said, just surrounded by, ex-military guys. My dad and my grandpa always took me down to the VFW, and these veterans were like, they were the titans in my life, listening to the stories that these guys told. And I was like, wow, that's what I want to do, like, for the rest of my life, So I had an unfortunate incident, a field training exercise at Camp Bullis, and ended up with a foot injury that sidelined me for a while. And it got to the point where it didn't look like I was going to be able to, kind of really fully recover from that. And and have the same kind of physical ability I had before. Running 2 miles in 12 minutes and the kind of things you need to be master fitness certified. Well, there was also a very, again, practical limitation in that I really had plans on being a career service member. And part of it was that I knew, again, the medical standards for officers were higher. The medical standard for, at the time I was an E4, and the medical standard to pass to the next rank at E5 required me to undergo something in the Army we call PLDC. It was a primary leadership and development school. And one of the requirements of that school is that you cannot take a modified PT test. So as a brief background for those who are unfamiliar, in the Army at least, we take physical fitness tests. But over time, certain people, you get injuries in the line of duty, and you're able to take modified physical fitness tests sometimes based on that injury. So if you've got a lower extremity injury, you can do an alternate event to the 2 mile run. So you can do a stationary bike ride or a swim or I don't know what other alternate events they have, but that's the most common is people with lower extremity injuries, because people are always blowing out their knees or doing some type of lower extremity, trauma in the military. And that doesn't necessarily have to sideline the military career. In my case, I could not take a modified physical fitness test at PLDC. You had to take an unmodified. So I was basically stuck. There was no way for me to advance my career, with the exception of I could undergo at the time what was called a medical evaluation board, which is something I'm sure you're familiar with. But again, just as a background for the listeners, when a soldier is injured and there is a question about their fitness for deployability, there's a process that the military undergoes called a medical evaluation board. And basically one of two things are generally the outcome of that board is one, either you're found fit for duty and that restriction can be removed from your record, or you're found not fit for duty and typically retired, or I guess you're retired if your rating is 30% or more and you're just, honorably discharged from service if it's less than that. So anyway, I went through, I told my doc, I said, well, I want to go through I'm going to go through the MEB because I disagree with the findings. I think that while this causes me some pain, I think I can, tough it out and make it through. So I went through the process, and unbeknownst to me at the time is that the MEB process doesn't solely evaluate the injury in question. They do a full systems evaluation. And throughout that process, that they found out I had actually a whole bunch of other stuff going on. Some, some autoimmune issues and, just a host of other medical issues that even I didn't know that I had going on. And so ultimately I ended up getting service-connected ratings for, particularly for a bunch of autoimmune issues and being medically retired from the military. So it wasn't even my choice. And, in retrospect, I still to this day, if I thought that, I could have won that MEB, I would have loved it. I loved every minute of, I shouldn't say I loved every minute. There were some minutes I hated on active duty, but I thoroughly enjoyed serving my country and looking forward. I definitely have a sincere interest in working at the VA. It's something I've had a lot of experience with, both personally, from my own medical issues and from my dad and my grandfather, and friends that have, had both good and bad experiences at the VA. I'm not one of those guys who's totally like, oh, everything's about the VA is bad, but I think there's room for improvement.
The extremes are never right.
Right. So I think there's room for improvement. And, I think as a veteran, one of the things I always have appreciated is when I have a service provider who is also a veteran and understands, particularly the tolls that active duty, can take on your body. There's kind of a rapport that they develop with you, and it feels like, okay, I don't have to explain to this individual, why, my body is in this kind of condition. It's like, yes, the reason I have avulsion fractures in my back is because I used to rappel out of helicopters. Okay. This is,
Okay. All right. So how long has it been since you were medically discharged, medically separated, medically retired, whatever, and now? What has that time length been?
It's actually over 20 years now. So
a long time.
A long time.
So what have you been doing in that interim?
Lots of things. I think for probably the thing that I want to, reiterate the most, because I see a lot of non-trad pre-meds really struggle with this idea that they've been stay-at-home parents, and they think that, well, I was a stay-at-home parent, I didn't do anything, or I didn't do anything that a medical school might be interested in. And I would say, that's been my primary role. I primarily have been a stay-at-home parent. Technically, yes, I serve as the chief technical officer of the corporation that my wife is the CEO of, and we run, and it's been a successful venture. But my primary job has been taking care of my kids, particularly because my two oldest had Asperger's, and so when you are raising two special needs kids, raising kids in general is outrageously time consuming and just takes intellectual stamina that some people don't realize how just how challenging it is. But I think when you add special needs kids into that, the dynamic changes even more. And really just you really it's a full-time dedicated job. And so I've worked technically, again, I have worked in the tech industry, everything from starting out in hardware, crossing over into software, and eventually into fintech and data analytics. But my primary day-to-day responsibilities have been getting my two oldest across the finish line and graduated and into college, which was something that from a very early age I was told just kind of accept that they weren't going to be typical, and that a future that was, involved going to college and having a career was probably not something I should expect of them. And I just refused to accept that.
Why at this point are you getting back into this, or however long ago you started to get back into the pre-med game? Why?
So this journey started, I would say in 2015, it really kind of kicked off. And so part of it was that I knew I had a time frame for when those two oldest were going to graduate. And when they graduated and went off to college, I knew that I was going to do something, full time, not be a parent full time anymore, but do something more, career oriented. And I had a lot of things to consider, and there are lots of things that interest me. I'm one of those super Renaissance type people who they're just like I love physics, I love astronomy, I love engineering. But with the birth of my third child in 2015, I ran across a doc who actually had taken the non-traditional route to medical school. So my wife's OB-GYN had actually been an architect prior to becoming a doctor. And I was very surprised to learn that. And I was surprised to learn that because the way she operated, her manner of being, her, I guess if you would call it physicianhood, was so good that I would have never expected she'd done anything in her life other than be a physician.
Why do you say that?
Well, because I guess maybe I had this preconceived notion that, to be a really good doctor, to be really good at anything, you have to just do that your whole life. From the get-go, you have to be, if you're going to be a phenomenal, whatever, auto mechanic, you have to be a phenomenal auto. That's something you got to start out with when you're young. If you have to be, if you're going to be a phenomenal physician, this is something you need to start doing when you were, 25 or 26 when you graduated medical school. And I've since actually seen data, actual hard data that suggests that's actually not the truth. One of the great books that I read along this journey was called Moonwalking with Einstein. And Josh Foye, who ended up being one of the U.S. memory champions, kind of details his journey, how he went from being an average journalist to a U.S. memory champion. And he really delves into the learning process. And it's interesting that pretty much with the exception of surgeons, that actually a lot of physicians peak in their ability just a few years out of residency, and don't significantly improve their skill sets. And this is, again, just, data sets. And of course, this is, overall general, because it's not true for every physician, of course. But in general, you're not going to, and this isn't just with physicians, this is with most careers, is, once you've done something for a few years, you're pretty much, in the groove that you're going to be at, and you're not going to, be significantly better as time goes on. And so that was kind of my hang up, I think, prior to one of the reasons why when I was considering all these things that I might do, a physician never crossed my mind, because I thought, I don't want to do something if I can't be good at it. If I can't be truly, adept at something, I wouldn't want to, I wouldn't want to pursue that, especially something like healthcare, because I'd been involved in healthcare, and I had seen firsthand what happens when someone's not adept at being a healthcare provider. I mean, it leads to very tragic consequences. And so,
was there any concern that it wasn't just a longevity thing? Like, I'm not going to be doing it long enough to get good at it? Or was there concern like, I am not smart enough to do it?
Certainly, I think there was definitely some self-doubt that, well, I don't know if I can do this or not. But, I've been fortunate enough in my life to be surrounded by, really positive people, my wife and friends and my parents, for the most part, have never said, oh, you're biting off more than you can chew. They've always just said, if anybody can do it, you can do it. So there was maybe some, personal inkling of that, but not there definitely wasn't a lot of external pressure like, oh, dude, I don't think you can handle that. When I told the people in my closest circle that I was considering this, everyone just said, oh, yeah, that's great, dude. Yeah, you make a great doctor.
Cool.
So, okay.
See you in 8 years.
Yeah.
So what was that first step for you to actually get back into this world?
The first step was having a real honest heart to heart with my wife, and saying, look, this is, I had done a lot of lurking, in various forums and Reddit and, SDN and stuff. And, certainly, there's a lot of negativity out there. There's, lots of, residents and medical students and even attendings that have, fallen into this nihilistic worldview that, oh my God, like this is the most awful life anyone could ever choose. And, being a doctor is the seventh circle of Dante's Inferno, and, so I tried to balance out those negative opinions with the positive opinions. People said, hey, look, yes, it's tough, but it's doable. And if you are diligent about, managing your time, and you set time aside for your family, that it doesn't have to destroy your marriage, and it doesn't have to destroy your relationship with your kids or with your friends. And so the first step really was having a heart to heart with my wife and saying, hey, look, there's going to be some hard times ahead. And if that's not something that you think that, we can weather together, then, let's not do this. I can do something that's less taxing. Mm-hmm. And so the first step was getting the green light from her. And like I said, she's been super supportive. Never, she has never really given me any pushback. And that would be, again, one real piece of advice I would put forward to especially non-trads is that if you really want to do this, maybe it's not impossible to do it without the support of your significant other, but man, it's so much easier when that person who you are, most involved with is really 100% behind you, because there are tough times in the process. And having that person on board with you really makes it makes all the difference in the world for me, because I think that if I hadn't been in that position, I probably would have chose at some point in time to discontinue the path if I didn't have such a good support system behind me.
Yeah. What was it like to get back into the college world after having gone to college and dropped out many years ago?
Well, so at first it was super disappointing to me because I had, prior to deciding to do this, I had kind of on and off went to school, you know, when my kids were younger. And so I had, up till that point, I had, a good solid 3 years of college finally under my belt. And I needed, about a year's worth of college left to graduate. So I thought, okay, this is cool. I can go to medical school. I got 1 year of school and I'll take this MCAT thing and I'm off to college, right? I'm off to med school. Because, that's what I thought. You need a degree and you need to take the MCAT, right? And then woe is me. I found out that, well, the prerequisites that you need, unless essentially your 3 years were as a bio major, your prerequisites are going to take you 3 years to do. So I just remember feeling really, really defeated when I realized that I was like, wow, I'm at least 3 years away from even starting medical school. Mm-hmm. So when I realized that timeline was extended, it was kind of disheartening. And my first semester back was like, super uncoordinated. It was like the first time you get back on a bicycle after you haven't been on one for a long, long time. And I was just doing everything wrong. I was making stacks of flashcards and reading textbooks and underlining and outlining, every single, I look at my textbook and I'm like, well, I just pretty much highlighted the whole page. So it was a point.
It's that meme where the person's there with yellow paintbrushes painting the whole page.
So I got an A on my first test in general bio and I thought, okay, this is cool. I can handle this. And I got a C on my second test and I thought, okay, I can't handle this. And then I kind of, it was at that point in time, that really was, a big game changer for me was reading that book by Josh Foyer, because I realized that if I was going to do this just rote memorization route was not going to work. There was too much information, particularly with my limited time schedule, because I still had, at the time I had 3 children. And again, still 2 of them were special needs. So a lot of times my day would consist of, I would go to school all day, come home, deal with anything that needed to be dealt with the business. So, technical aspect, we've got servers crashing here or there that, need to be reformatted or whatever needed to be done. And then when that was said and done, it was sometimes staying up until, 10 or 11 o'clock at night doing homework with my own kids, doing their homework to make sure that, not doing it, but helping them through their homework, to make sure that they were keeping their grades up. And, then maybe it's 11 o'clock and I promised, my wife along this journey that we'd spend some time together. So we spend half an hour, 45 minutes together, and then it's midnight and then it's time for me to get to study. And so there's just too much information, right? I got to be back up at 6 o'clock the next morning. So if I'm reading every word, I can't do it. So if I'm making all these flashcards, I can't do it. So I knew I needed a better process, and I kind of started doing some research, and then this idea of this, the memory palace and these memory tricks and stuff kind of came into play. And so early on, I had to learn to become really adept at what material I was using. And probably the other really big thing that happened that was a game changer was I had a commute. So my commute was maybe 30 to 40 minutes one way, each way every day. And again, because of my schedule, having to be home at certain times for the kids, I pretty much had to space my classes out so that I was on campus every day. I couldn't take the late classes because I couldn't afford to be at school late. So I was commuting every day, and I thought, boy, this is a huge time suck. I'm just wasting this time. So I put out an ad on Craigslist for someone to who would be willing to read my textbooks for me and read them in and record them.
Nice.
Read PowerPoint slides, to read my notes that I had taken in class, and read them into like an MP3 format, upload them to Google Drive so that I could listen to them while I was, driving.
Yep.
And it was kind of funny because I thought, well, this is such a strange thing. Nobody's going to actually respond to this ad. And I just got a ton of people that responded, and a ton of like really good people. I actually had a hard time making a decision.
Yeah.
Did
you ever look at, just to interrupt you for a second, did you ever look at contacting the publishers of the books to see if they had ADA compliant versions? Typically, the books will have ADA compliant versions for people who need to listen to a book.
Right. Yeah. And so I had experimented actually with, some of the automated readers to begin with.
Those aren't very good.
Yeah. And they weren't very good. And so honestly, the ADA thing, that's actually news to me. I didn't know that. So maybe I could have saved, maybe I could have saved a whole bunch of money over these years, but know that the guy who reads for me, though, he's been with me now for going on 4 years now. And he is, he's in advertising actually, but he's probably has this amazing background in biology and chemistry now because he's spent 4 years reading all this stuff for me, and actually plan to continue that relationship through medical school because I'm going to have a little bit of a commute for med school as well. So, so those two things kind of one, getting rid of this old school mentality that I had grown up with where, you read every page in the book, make flashcards, go back and read the book again. And really learning to optimize my time. Cause it wasn't just, the drive. It was also times walking the dog. It was, when I was giving the boys a bath at night, I had put this stuff on a Bluetooth speaker, and they're just kind of, they want to spend their oblivious time in the bathtub, just kind of playing or whatever. So I'm listening to a biochem lecture, or biochem. So so I
listen to podcasts all the time like that. Every spare second I have an AirPod in listening to something. And then my wife will be like, Ryan, are you listening? Yeah, hold on. Just get my attention. I'll stop listening. So what was the hardest part about being a pre-med and getting to the point now where you have an acceptance?
There's been lots of hard parts. Time management is the most critical. I mean, you really, there are days when I truly wish I was like, boy, man, I wish the only thing on my plate was school. What a relief that would be to only have to focus on, getting a good MCAT score.
Yeah.
There, as a non-traditional and not all traditional students, I think there's kind of, sometimes we have these warring camps where we have, the non-trads versus the trads, and some non-trads kind of have this take that every traditional student is the student who mom and dad are paying for all their college and they don't have to work a job. And the only thing they have to do is, do their schoolwork, and then, they pound brews and play Xbox in their free time. And that's the gist of their existence. And I have lots of of traditional student friends who don't fit that mold at all. They still have to work, and they have lots of other things on their plate, very much in the vein of traditional students. But I think for all of us, the big thing becomes time management, because there are so many things that pull us in so many different directions, and even the things that are med school admission related that pull us in directions, particularly when a lot of times, and I know we had kind of touched on this earlier, there seems to be, there's definitely a lot of conflicting opinions about, how important these ECs are. How important is your time at the food bank or your time with hospice compared to your MCAT score, compared to your GPA. So it's hard to kind of balance that, because you're like, well, I want to make sure I'm not short on my ECs. I want to make sure that I don't look like I'm a GPA robot, but at the same time, I know my GPA has to be at a certain level because statistics are statistics, and the median GPA is what it is. For matriculants, it's what it is, and I don't even know what it is this cycle, but I think at least for AMCAS last cycle, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of a 3.8 for MD schools. So I mean, it's fairly high,
Mm-hmm.
And it's a pretty steep bell curve, especially when you look at when you get down into the MSAR stats and you look. You say, well, the median's at, a 3.8, but there's not much deviation between the 10th percentile and the 90th percentile, so managing, trying to find that balance between, not shuttering yourself away from friends and family, making sure that you're still making a living and putting, food on the table, making sure that your GPA remains high, that you're prepared for the MCAT, that your extracurriculars remain strong, and then trying to stay healthy in the whole process, finding some time for yourself, right?
Mentally and physically.
Right, mentally and physically.
Yep.
And so time is the hardest part. I think time management skills. If you if this were like a video game where you get to pick your upgraded skill when you begin, like what skill do you want to upgrade? Upgrade your time management skills, because that's going to serve you. I think it's going to give you the most mileage through the process.
Yeah. Why do you think you were successful with the application cycle?
Man, probably again, support system. Aside from having an amazing family behind me, I've been really fortunate to run into some really good mentors along the way. I had a couple of particularly strong mentors that really kind of kept me in line and helped me, dot the I's and cross the T's and make sure that I, was in the best position that I could be in. And I always tell people there is absolutely, I think, an element of luck involved. But there's a huge element of preparation involved too. And luck is kind of where those two things, meet.
Mm-hmm. I like the quote, the harder I work, the luckier I got.
Right. So, I'm a big motocross fan, and one of the guys who recently retired, his name was Trey Kennard, racer out of Oklahoma. And he always used to say that, luck is where opportunity meets preparation. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the thing is, you have to be well prepared. And so big shout out to my PI at UT Southwestern, who, really just has, she has offered so much support and provided so much of her personal time through this process that I definitely do not think I would have been as successful, if successful at all, without her help along this way. So, finding a good mentor is a really kind of, I think, key. And that doesn't have to be a doctor. I mean, I think that can be somebody at school. It can be a professor. It can be, it might just be your uncle. It might be somebody who, it needs to be, I think, somebody who's familiar with the process. But having a good mentor, leaning on them when you're unsure, and at the same time, being respectful of their time, reciprocating their, I guess their cordiality with you, I think maybe, because, one of the things that becomes really tempting to do is when you get an awesome mentor, it's like every time you have a question, you're like, I'm just going to ask them, right? I'm just going to text them. I'm just going to, and I think you need to also understand that, they're not, their time is valuable. Their time is extremely valuable. And so you need to be mindful of their time. And when you do that, I think you develop a really good relationship with them where they know that you're not going to pester them about everything that's, a little nuance. And so that when you do ask them a question, they're okay to stop, take time out of their day and give you a thoughtful answer that kind of helps you in the process.
For the student listening to this who is 30, 35, 40 years old and questioning whether or not this is something that they should look at getting back into. As you are embarking on your medical school journey now, what words of wisdom would you have for them?
Well, the first thing I would say is, you need to do a kind of a ruthless self-inventory. And that includes, again, am I willing to endure the sacrifices that this is going to take? Are my financials in a position that make this, feasible? If it's not feasible financially, then, that doesn't mean it won't always be, but if it's not the right time, then, that, especially for a non-trad, is something you really have to, you just can't mince it. It's either there or it's not. Again, I've been fortunate to have, my wife is smart as a whip. And so thankfully she's, run a successful company for many years, has left us in a good financial position. I also was always interested in investing. So I started investing, probably at a fairly young age, in my 20s, I was investing, and had a bit of a stroke of luck because I was also kind of an early adopter of cryptocurrency. So I bought into Bitcoin pretty heavily back when it was, worth almost nothing. And so that kind of paid us out fairly well as well. So you have to kind of do this inventory, right? Am I willing to accept this? What comes along with this? And the other thing is you have to kind of, really look at where are you at academically from the past, because we all have kind of our tarnished academic past. I think most non-trads, have at least, one or two black marks in their past. And I had actually a really unique situation, which is, kind of brings me to something that was amazing about being in Texas. And that is the Academic Fresh Start program that Texas has. And so when I went through Kilo School in the Army had kind of a deal worked out with George Washington where everybody who completed the program got 60 semester hours of college credit from GWU, right? So I was like, it's time. I was like, well, okay, sounds like a good deal. I got to do it anyway. Why not get half a year's worth of college? Well, however that turned out, I ended up with transcripts from GWU with basically straight B's across the board. Now, I graduated third in my Kilo class. I was given, duty station of choice. I busted my butt in Kilo School and did really well. And so, for the average listener out there, they, if they haven't embarked upon this process, they may think, well, B's, that's pretty good. Well, B's are not really good for, especially 60 semester hours worth of B's is really bad for medical, for a pre-med. And so that was kind of crushing my GPA. It was bringing my, otherwise I had a 4.0 outside of that, and it was dragging my GPA down into the 3.5 range, which is, again, for, probably for most careers and most people, 3.5 is like, well, that's pretty good. That means you got half A's and half B's. You can't really ask for more than that, but adcoms ask for more than that. So
it's still a pretty good GPA. Yeah,
it's still pretty good. And to be fair, I applied outside of Texas and had, I had success at least with the DO schools out of Texas. I will say I had absolute radio silence from all the AMCAS schools. So I'm kind of a really good case example of, how valuable is the upward trend. Mm-hmm. And so my upward trend was the last, I want to say 121 hours of school or so were straight A's, including all of my prerequisites, all the organic chemistries, the biochemistries, the physics, straight A's. The last 10 years of my academic record have been nothing but straight A's. And despite that, my out-of-state GPA it actually ended up being right around a 3.6, and my science GPA was on the upwards of a 3.85. So, still fairly solid, reasonable numbers. Yeah. I had a median MCAT, so it was a 509, nothing to write home to mom about, but median matriculant MCAT. And I applied to, I think maybe I want to say maybe 15 of the, I would say, least competitive AMCAS schools.
Mm-hmm.
And I got nothing but radio silence from all of them. And I would say that.
But here, so I want to cut you off right there.
Okay.
Because you have no clue that it was your stats that you got radio silence because of that. Those are amazing stats that I see plenty of students getting lots of activity from schools. So
right.
I don't want you to lead the listener astray going, that's why I didn't get, right?
Right.
Those are good numbers. So was it your personal statement? Was it your secondaries? Was it how did you apply late in the cycle?
Right.
So there are so many variables. So you can't play that game.
There are. And so the reason I say I think I'm an excellent case study is that a lot of those variables were controlled for. So I submitted to all three services at the same time, TMD, SAS, ACOMAS, and AMCAS. Same personal statement, same extracurriculars. Everything was pretty much the same across all three services with the exception of my GPA.
Mm-hmm.
And so in Texas, I had a 4.0.
Mm-hmm.
And
because of their academic forgiveness?
Because of academic fresh start, right? I ended up with, I want to say 15 invites. I went on 7 or 8 interviews and 5 acceptances.
Yeah.
And so I would say, again, if I had, 13 invitations out of the ACOMAS and the TMD SAS schools, that would say that probably my letters of rec, my personal statement, those things that, can be contributing factors, they couldn't have been too bad, right? They couldn't have been too awful, or I wouldn't have had such success with the other services.
Yep.
And so the one variable that was different for the AMCAS was my GPA.
Well, there's more variables, right? Because secondary essays are also variables and other
certainly.
Yeah.
I would say one of the things about that too is, again, it's a lot of those schools that I applied to didn't have secondaries. So a lot of those.
What schools don't have secondaries?
So I think, let's see. So I want to say maybe Drexel didn't. I actually have a list set up of them because I applied to some of them specifically because I didn't have secondaries because I didn't want to go out of Texas. And so this is one of the mitigating or one of the I think confounders, as we'll call it, is that and again, I don't know if this is statistically proven, but I think it's kind of an accepted fact is that non-Texas schools tend to maybe not look as favorably upon interviewing Texas residents who look like they might stay in Texas, just because they know that the cost of tuition in Texas is so low that most Texas residents, if given an acceptance to a Texas MD versus an out-of-state MD, will almost overwhelmingly always choose.
And that's that you can't measure, right? You can't. Right. You can't go. Right. And it's interesting because you're saying, hey, the one variable is my MCAT GPA potentially at these out-of-state schools, but that may have hurt you that your GPA was so good, like your science GPA, your MCAT score was solid, that the MD schools out of Texas were like, he's going to get into a Texas school, let's not bother.
Right.
We'd want to interview him if he wasn't a Texas resident.
Right.
And so there's just so many variables. And you mentioned the luck earlier, and I don't know if I'd call that luck, but that's part of the game, right? It's just part of the game. And so it's interesting that you said, I didn't want to go outside of Texas. Then I would question why you applied anyway.
Well, definitely part of it's the safety net.
Yeah.
You don't get this far and not apply broadly because particularly at my age. So, I was interviewing at 44 years old, right? Not a lot of 40. Matter of fact, I was the oldest applicant. On every interview I went on, I was the oldest applicant. And I had I don't want to say several, but at least 2 interviewers that made what may have kind of been borderline inappropriate age-based comments. so I was aware of it, but I'm just like, I can't change it. So, I'm not going to stress about it. But so part of it was the safety net. Part of it was actually strategic in the sense that my hope was that, and this actually did play out, particularly with some of the out-of-state ACOMA schools, is that I wanted to get as many interviews under my belt as I could, particularly before I got to the schools that I really was interested in attending, because I can, tell you from personal experience and from pretty much everyone I've talked to, is that when you start out on the interview trail, no matter how many mock interviews you do or how well prepared you think you are, there's just something different about sitting in the hot seat. Yep. And by the time you get to the end of the interview trail, you're kind of an old hand, and you're much more relaxed, and it just kind of feels like a conversation like we're having.
Yeah.
But when you first start out, particularly if somebody hits you with a response that you haven't prepared for, you just you freeze, and you're like, oh, I don't even know what to say at this point in time, and the silence is killing me. And
that's an interesting tactic, because I actually don't recommend students try to do that. For one specific reason. I agree that if it works, great, right? Get some practice under your belt. But when reality doesn't meet expectations, right, we're thrown for a loop, and it can destroy us. And so if you go in going, okay, I'm going to apply to these quote unquote easy schools that I don't really want to go to, but I'm going to interview there first, and then I'll interview at my top choice school after that. You have no control over, number one, that you're going to get an interview. Number two, when you're going to get an interview. And so I don't want students to try to play that game, and then all of a sudden their first interview is their top choice, and then they're even more freaked out.
Right. And absolutely. And you are right. That absolutely can happen. I will say this as the caveat: I didn't apply to any schools that I wouldn't be willing to go to.
Good.
And so, for example, my wife said, Chicago's off limits. We're not living in Chicago. So
interesting. Okay.
There definitely were, there were a lot of northern schools. Again, my wife is a southern girl, and she was not interested in snow. So there were a couple of northern schools that I applied to, and the only reason they were even allowed on the list is because we have family there. So other than that, I do agree with you. You shouldn't apply to a school certainly that you wouldn't want to attend.
Yeah.
And I didn't apply to any schools that I didn't want to attend. Any of the schools that I applied to, I applied to them, not solely with, oh, I hope I get an interview here, or this is my backup school, but my thought was, look, if I get accepted here, I would go there. I would want to go there. And there were schools that I turned down invites to that I'm like, man, I actually would have really liked to go there, but I've already gotten accepted to a school that is a better fit for me, at least for me and my family. So definitely don't apply to schools that you wouldn't want to go to, just because that may be your only acceptance that you get. And so you don't want to do that. But certainly I do agree with you that there's no control over the process. And part of it is that my third interview was my top choice school. Mm-hmm. So out of those 7 or 8 interviews that I did, number 3 was my top choice school. And so I didn't get all the practice in that I wanted to get. And that top choice school ended up being an awful interview. I was woefully unprepared for. Yeah. I don't want to say woefully unprepared, but it was the worst. It was the worst of all of my interviews.
Yeah. And I just remembered another point that I discourage this tactic is because you get practice under your belt, but what don't you get?
Well,
you don't get feedback.
Yeah, you don't get
feedback. Have no idea how you did, right? And so it's impossible to go, okay, I know where I messed up. I know I shouldn't have said this and that. And maybe you have some recollection and some idea. The majority of students I talk to are like completely blank with their mind. Like, I have no idea what just happened. So it's really hard tactic. But
well, I think the idea too is that we're the worst judges of how the interview actually went, right? Yeah. So we may think it went awful, and it might have went great. And as a point of note is that interview that I thought was so awful is where I ended up matriculating. So
there you go.
That's again. So maybe we are the worst judge of that. So there, I do agree with you that this the idea of applying to multiple schools only or solely for the purpose of trying to get those interviews under your belt is that's a bad tactic. But maybe as a fringe benefit towards other goals, in the sense that yes, if it's a school you want to go to, or you'd like to, it doesn't have to be your top choice. Obviously, everybody usually only has one or two top choices, and I would never recommend applying to only one or two schools, because that's probably not a good idea unless you're just a home run candidate for that school. And even then, I don't know that it's a good idea, because it's the numbers are so small that get accepted to even schools that have high acceptance rates, that are maybe 10%. 10% is a pretty small number.
Yep.
So you do want to get a lot of the mock interviews ahead of time help. And I think one of the things that really helped me too was I sat down with some of my buddies. This was one of the places where your book came in really handy, is because we don't always know what questions to ask. Mm-hmm. And so when you're sitting down with your buddies, you just say, well, just ask me these questions here. Just point them to a page. Say, ask me these questions, and particularly for me, like, I picked out the questions that I thought I might have a hard time with. And also the questions that I thought I might, at least in my mind, I thought I kind of had handled. Mm-hmm. And it was very interesting, particularly because, it really depends on who's doing your mock interviews, if you're doing them with faculty or whatever. But a lot of the faculty are very, particularly, I think, again, if you're Nontrad, they're maybe less inclined to, give you negative feedback. Whereas your buddies are just kind of like, look, dude, I'm going to tell you, if you messed up, I'm going to tell you.
Those are good friends.
Yeah, those are the good friends, right? And I remember, particularly, sitting in the student union, and my buddy asked me one of those questions that, he asked me one of the questions from the Premed playbook, and I rattled off my standard response that I had prepared, and he said, you kind of don't really sound sure on that. He said, maybe from your worldview that sounds okay. He said, but from my end, it almost, sounded a little, maybe a little tinged, maybe tinged with a little bit of, racism. And I said, oh, what, really? Oh my, like, I would have never thought that, so, that's where the feedback part really plays a role. And that's something you don't get when you do the real interviews. You don't have feedback until the very end. And even then you don't have feedback, because whether you get accepted or not accepted might not have been anything to do with the interview. Could have just been that, everybody else had worse interviews than you or whatever. So, having some friends that are willing to be ruthless and give you feedback and say, no, bro, you need to work on that.
Important.
It's important.
Yeah. Good. What does the future hold for you? What do you hope to accomplish?
Everybody has this naivete going into, med school, that they think they know what they want to do or where they want to work. And, I think one of my secondary questions was, describe your ideal practice. And so my ideal practice would be, obviously some specialty that leads me to a fellowship in med tox, and then a job at working at the VA, hopefully with some academic ties. So that I could
tox being medical toxicology.
Right. Yeah. So medical toxicology. I have a particular interest in, I'm a Gulf War era vet. Mm-hmm. And so I have lots of buddies that, are dealing with, the repercussions of their service in the Middle East. Everything from, and I don't want to go down a rabbit's hole because, there's lots of competing theories about whether any of this stuff is actually, legitimate concern, depleted uranium or, the exposure from burn pits. And I've seen the gamut. I've seen, some toxicologists will, they'll roll their eyes at, anything that's not just like settled science. We injected a chelating agent into your veins directly, and that's the only toxicology solution we're going to accept. Versus, some people are just like, hey, we don't know, and we don't understand, and we're still learning. So, without going too far down the rabbit's hole, I have a real interest in kind of the impact of military presence in in war areas, particularly in combat zones, and not just on the military service members, but also on the civilian populations that we left behind. Because I think that there are, civilian populations left behind in these Middle Eastern countries that also are suffering from, the effects of, conflict, and again, whatever that may have been, I don't proclaim to know exactly what that is, but it's something that interests me. What was the causative agent? What is the causative agent that causes so many people to have, these issues, both civilian and military? And, addressing that, I think, as part of, not only my desire to, kind of continue to serve my country, but also kind of this global citizenry kind of ideal that has developed as I've gotten older, and realizing that, I love my country. I'm deeply patriotic, but I also realize that my duty doesn't stop at our borders. That, I have a duty as a human being, not as a physician, but just as a human being to other human beings. Just because they don't reside in my country doesn't mean I don't have a duty to use, whatever skill set that, I've been, blessed with or endowed with to, better other men and women. And so, that's where I would love to see myself, doing something in med tox. And the caveat being is that med tox is not really a full-time specialty. So you got to kind of do something else with med tox. And most toxicologists are actually emergency medicine doctors by trade, and emergency medicine is kind of hard on the body. It's not really an ideal specialty for someone who's going to be, 48 graduating medical school. So I'm kicking around the idea, and we'll see. There's, medicine in general interests me. I don't think there's anything about medicine that I find disinteresting. So, family medicine's interesting. I like anesthesia. I was privileged enough to do a week-long anesthesia shadowing stint at Fort Worth Medical City, and that was like super fun. I spent some time shadowing a neurologist. I've enjoyed it all. I think every there's, probably my biggest grief about this whole process is I'm like, why do I have to just pick one thing? Like I'd like to do lots of things. So, wherever it takes me. I'm pretty open to the journey at this point in time, but I'm a chem nerd. I've spent 3 years tutoring organic chemistry. So, I really like any part that involves chemistry. So, anesthesia and nephrology, all of these, chem heavy things I'm really interested in.
All right. There you have it. An interesting discussion with Robert about his journey to medical school. And we didn't get into it a bunch. We thought we were going to dive into it, but Robert had a lot of other great stuff to talk about. And so we didn't really dive into the whole MCAT and GPA. And I pushed back a little bit here and there. But he had some great points about not getting any interviews at out-of-state MD schools. And it's interesting. And again, that thought came to me of, if there's an out-of-state MD school that's like, well, he's a Texas applicant and he has good stats, he's probably going to get into a Texas school and he'll probably go there. And I just wonder if that is a part of the thought process. I'd have to assume it is, right? Medical schools want to accept the best and brightest, but they also especially with the new traffic rules this year, medical schools are very, very cautious this year with being careful of who they are accepting and making sure they're not under accepting, making sure they're not over accepting, because the way that schools are getting lists and seeing who is going where and everything has changed this year as we're recording this in 2019. So it's changed for the 2018 to 2019 cycle, which is what Robert was a part of. So I wonder how much that played a part in his not getting any interviews at out-of-state schools, out of Texas, right? MD schools. But at the end of the day, he had multiple acceptances, could choose where he wanted to go, and ultimately made the choice that would fit him and his family. So best of luck to Robert. I hope you got some great information out of this podcast today. If you are interested in getting some great experience outside of the classroom, I encourage you to check out the University of Colorado School of Medicine's Wilderness Medicine program, one that I teach at. I go for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and teach all about the application process, the pre-med process, personal statements, etc. You get to go up into the mountains for a week and run around the woods and help treat trauma patients and learn how to do wilderness medicine, if that is something that you can do. You get some shadowing experience, some EMS ride-alongs, tons of great experience, and they also offer scholarships if you qualify. You can find out more information by texting the word WILDMED to 44222. Again, if you text the word WILDMED, all one word, to 44222, I'll get you a link to the University of Colorado Wilderness Medicine course, and you can use the promo code MSHQ to save some money on that course as well. All right, I hope you have a great week. I hope this discussion with Robert today was helpful, gave you some great advice, hopefully gave you some motivation if you are an older, non-traditional student, that this is possible, going back to medical school, getting multiple acceptances, and ultimately living the dream that you want to live. Hope you have a great week. We'll see you next time here on the Pre-Med Years.
This is MedEd Media.